Hanji.
I said, Namaste. My name is Yvette Rosser, and I have a PhD from the University of Texas in Austin, and I studied about Indian history and education, and in that capacity, in the mid-90s, 96 I believe, I published an article called Persuasive Pedagogical Paradigms about the way that Indian education has retained the methodology and the paradigm that was established during the colonial times. And a few months later, by the end of the semester, I got an email from a professor at Delhi University who's named Bharat Gupt, congratulating me on what a good paper it was. And that's been 20 years ago, and we've become very good friends since then, his whole family and I. And I still take lots of inspiration from Bharat Gupt. He is a very knowledgeable person. I've often called him one of India's unused intellectuals. He has such good ideas about a broad spectrum of topics. And today we're going to talk about why in India, since independence, has there not been more of a rise, a growth, and a support for intellectuals from within the Hindu or the Indian, the indigenous ethos. So that's my first question to you, Dr. Gupt, is why do you think since independence that there hasn't been as much of a groundswell of actually proper publications and professorial positions given to the more Hindu indigenous scholars, even though I know they're out there because, sort of on a pamphleteering mode. They have a lot of things that they've done and written, but there's not been, Fulbrightization, you should say, of these particular scholars. Do you have some, I know you have some really good ideas about this.
Well, thank you, Yvette, for giving me this opportunity to put my ideas. You are right. This is a major problem we face in India. After independence, we had a government which was politically independent, but unfortunately which was, and to this day, is not culturally and intellectually independent. It derives all its notions of what is a modern state, what is modern governance, even what is good for people of India. It derives all this from certain Western models, models which have been given by and large by academics and intellectuals from, let's say, from Cambridge to Berkeley, Cambridge, Oxford, Columbia, Chicago, Ivy League schools, etc. And it is their discourse which defines what is good for India and what is bad for India. This began with Jawaharlal Nehru, who was a secularist, as he called himself, and of course who was a Fabian socialist. Of course, his critics have also called him, quoting him, that he was last of the Englishmen. But that apart, the fact remains that he was a socialist. And socialism itself is not an indigenous system of thought. The major Indian systems of thought in the 20th century were certainly not socialist at all. Gandhiism was not socialist, although it covered what some socialists may call caring for the poorest of the poor, and that was the common point. But certainly it did not look upon the world in material terms or in terms of class conflict. Similarly, other great thinkers of India like Shri Aurobindo or Lokmanya Tilak, they did not have a socialist thought, and they were largely rooted in the old traditions of India, and in the ideas that are contained in the texts of India, texts from very ancient times, like the Rigveda, and then through the classical times and medieval times up to modern times. Texts not just in Sanskrit, of course the majority of them are in Sanskrit, almost 60 to 70% of the texts, if you take them right from most ancient times to modern, but in such a large number of other Indian languages. All these texts have a very different vision of what is the purpose of human existence and what is a country, what we today call a nation. So the ideas of traditional India found no place. As a matter of fact, it did not find any place at all in the socialist order of Jawaharlal Nehru. There was a big disjunct between modernity and tradition. And tradition was considered to be a sort of an enemy of modernity.
Right.
That if you are going to be modern, then you cannot be traditional. There was a schizophrenia which was very early woven into our...
almost like a self-hate,
Yes.
deprivation of the indigenous or the traditional narrative.
Quite so. Maybe it was not self-hate in the case of many people, but by and large, if it was not hatred, it was still a severe reservation.
Yeah.
A reservation, something you look askance. You don't really wish to honor it. Now, this is a very, very serious debility with the Indian discourse. Unfortunately, the reason why we have not been able to use even Western ideas, valuable Western ideas like liberty, equality, and fraternity, just to name some of the classic modern ideas of enlightenment. We have not been able to use them properly in India because we could not reconcile them with our tradition. So, in our attempt to make use of the West or to westernize, largely in socialist terms, without reconciling things with our tradition, we are neither Western nor Eastern, we are confused.
But is that mostly the intellectual class? Because don't you think, it seems like the villagers, I want to call them the villagers that are exposed to so much intellectualism and all this. I find that you could call them post-traditional. They're certainly not postmodern, but they kept their traditions and they just moved it into where they are now. And they're not so confused by the jargon that comes out of some of the higher institutions of learning because they haven't really been exposed to that. But they're very sincere in their Hindu beliefs, and they seems like they haven't been as confused by the jargon and the universities.
You are right, because they uphold the tradition in life, and that is real India. But unfortunately, the ruling class of India doesn't belong there. So those who rule India from within India and through certain influences from outside India, they are a different set of people. They are the schizophrenic people who have not been able to reconcile tradition and modernity. So the country suffers because those who have to provide governance, those who have to provide planning, those who have to provide future growth, their models are distorted. Their models cannot take India into future because they have so many disabilities. So the people try their best, but power is not in their hands. And therefore there is a lot of oppression in India, because it is the ruling classes which are kind of, if one may say, half westernized, or pseudo-westernized, or schizo-westernized, you can use any term, who are the ones who wield the power and who take the major decisions about the disposable of national wealth and strength.
Well, part of it too is, I think they've misinterpreted some of these terms, like particularly socialism, particularly secularism, because in its original context, it was that the government would have no hand in the religion. But that's because the religion that secularism rose up against was very invasive, and it was all or nothing. You had to believe this way, or you'd be kicked out of the community, or go to hell, or both. And Hinduism isn't a religion in that context. So the socialists, the post-Nehruvian socialists, they rejected Hinduism, just like it was just a regular religion. And it's more of a way of life and an ethos, and it's based on the Dharma, which is, the ringing true, the spirituality, the
so, of course, indeed. That is the disjunct I'm talking about.
Yes, it's crazy that this rejected something so good.
When our rulers, or the ruling classes, our own classes, political and intellectual classes, who became the legislators, when they looked upon religion, they had Western definitions of religion in mind. And in the West, by West of course we mean in Europe, not even in America, but largely in Europe, religion meant Christianity and what the Christian church was like. And you know that in Europe, for almost 1800 years or 1700 years, Christianity was a state power, you see. As the Christians say, that they had a temporal arm and a heavenly arm. So there was the church, which had its army, its rulers, its templars, its knights, its property, and then of course it has its ecclesia, its spiritual leadership. So the church had political power and material power right from the time Constantinos started Christianity as a state religion. And then it had the spiritual, theological control. Now in India, this never existed. None of the Indian sects have a competition with the king. In Christianity, it was always a competition between the monarch and the head of the church, the Pope and the monarch. And therefore, the rise of modern European thought, which began with the Renaissance, began with rejecting the political power of the state. And hence all secularism, as it developed in the West, is anti-church.
Right.
Not even anti-religion or anti-theology or anti-God, but mostly anti-church.
The institutionalized church, yeah.
Anti-church.
And there's nothing like that exists in India.
Now, in India, nothing of that sort existed, because in India, the spiritual norms, even the ethical norms were not made by the kings. They were recorded by the kings, like Manu, supposedly a Kshatriya, being a ruler, he wrote the Manusmriti, but then out of dozens and dozens of smritis or the moral codes of India, Manu is one. There is the Yagyavalkya, and there were earlier other sutras, etc. So the people who were making the moral code, the spiritual precepts and the spiritual norms of behavior for society, they did not come from the ruling class or the kingly class. In India, the king was dealing only with temporal or secular affairs. And once the law was made, it was followed all over India by people belonging to various sects, whether they were Vaishnavas or Shaivites or Buddhas or Jains, whether they were speaking a language like Tamil or they were speaking in ancient time a North Indian dialect like Prajya or Avantika or something, any other language. So the moral codes were one. In India, we had what you can broadly call a uniform civil code. Can you name to me a single text which could be called the Manusmriti of Buddhas? The Buddhist. Can you say like, this is the Buddhist moral code? Or this is the Jain moral code? This is the Shaiva moral code? No. They were moral codes or they were smritis which were applicable all over India. Of course, people in some region were more inclined towards certain codes depending upon the time, the place and the condition. And uniformity was never sought after. A broad commonness was sought after. But nothing more. A lot of diversity according to language, region, time, custom, conditions was customary law. And customary law, or what was called lokachara, very often had the right to rule out shastrachara, or what was laid down in the smritis. Now, this kind of a situation never existed in Europe, neither in Christianity nor in the modern Enlightenment laws that were formed. In Europe, they always wanted to go for a uniform code, and they wanted that uniform code to be enforced on all sections of populations. And in colonial times, that's how it was practiced. And that idea was brought into India. Once they come to India, once the colonizing powers come to Africa, then they start making certain concessions to some populations. And therefore the idea of an ethnic code for local people develops as different from the European Christian-centered code. Now, in India, when we became independent, we inherited this colonial model, which was largely a Christian model. And we wanted to enforce that, and so we said that there will be people who could be divided into minority and majority. So the so-called Hindu majority, whatever the word Hindu or would constitute of, and then we had the Hindus and then the Muslims, and various other divisions were made within the Hindu population as distinct from Hindu, which was not the case earlier. Like the Sikhs were made into a separate religion, you see, whereas there is hardly any grounds for them to be so distinct as the claims were made, because they follow the Nirguna system of Vedanta, that there is only one supreme being, Brahma, and the whole same idea is repeated like Ek Onkar. but it was called a separate religion. Now this was the kind of ethnic or ethnographic division which the British brought into India. And the British centered, or the Western trained Indian intellectuals like Jawaharlal Nehru followed since independence. And therefore they made this decision to divide the Indian population into minority and majority, and to say that the state will not adopt one or two or any religion. See, this is the idea. Now there is a big confusion in this. You see, the most important thing is morality. If the state is going to have any orderliness, it is essential that the state also follows certain moral norms. Where are those moral norms going to come from? Not out of the air. You see, in the West, most of these moral norms came from Christianity. And they were declared to be enlightened norms,
right,
or norms of enlightenment. Like monogamy, for instance. Monogamy was considered, because Christians followed monogamy. Nobody else in the world ever followed monogamy other than Christians. So it was said that monogamy, and at that time in 17th, 18th century, no divorce, that was a Christian law. And the Christian law was made into enlightenment law. Then the idea of the individual soul was made into the idea of the individual citizen, because Christianity talks about individual soul, soul of a human being. So that was considered to be the ground for making an individual citizen, a secular individual citizen. Now, according to various other systems of thought, there is no individual soul, or even if there is an individual soul, it goes into various other kinds of life forms. So all the Jains, the Bauddhas, the Vaishnavas, the Shaivites, they all believe that if I have this body, human body today, then I certainly must have had many other bodies of a lion or an ant or an insect, So where is the individual soul as an individual human being created for all times to come? So don't you understand that this whole paradigm of enlightenment, secularism, secular West is just another version of fundamental Christian ideas?
Well, one thing they don't talk about in that whole concept is they talk about individual rights and the right to pursue happiness and stuff, but there's not a lot of discussion about the individual's responsibility. And we're very concerned that the individual has freedom and autonomy and their rights, but where's their connection? That's also should be assumed and required, that their connection with this society, the need to give back. Seems like the paradigm is all in the one direction, upstanding individual, supporting the individual, but where's the individual giving back and supporting to society, giving to society? I mean, it's sort of like not inherent in the paradigm.
Yes.
In a sort of weird way.
This is because of a very peculiar and unfortunate development in European history. The Christian paradigm gave us the individual soul and therefore the individual civil citizen. But in the Christian world, before Enlightenment or before Renaissance, this individual soul was more or less the property of the church.
Sure.
The church would say what is right for you, what is wrong for you. But the modern secular citizen in Europe the enlightened citizen, was not to be ruled and governed by the state, by the secular state. He or she was entirely independent. He or she was a world to herself. So whereas Christianity again had a bigger community life, the secular state had nothing except individualism. Now, this kind of individualism, or the concept of what is an individual, when it comes to India, it is again in contradiction with the traditional systems of thought. Because I don't think of myself as an individual disconnected from all other forms of life or all other forms or aspects of creation. I am one. I am combined. I may appear different at a time, but I am actually not different. So, therefore, even as a human being, and if I am enlightened to a certain degree, then I shall treat a dog very differently from somebody who would treat a dog as if there is no unity or no connection between a human being and a dog. You see, in the Christian world, there is a chain of being. There is God on the top, then archangels, then angels, then human beings, and then other forms of life,
demonic stuff,
animals, and then finally the reptiles, and then so you have a chain of being. There is a whole status. Imagine the big contradictions that European philosophy inherits. When you say equality, it is not really equality. Now, all these notions with their contradictions come to India. That is why we're having this big debate on vegetarianism, whether to eat beef or not today. Because earlier in India it was acknowledged that, look, killing life may be necessary under certain conditions, but the more you avoid it, the better it is. And this has been the development over thousands of years. And now, even on other grounds, we realize that being a vegetarian is better for all, not just human beings, but for all other forms of life and even for the planet.
Absolutely. Animal husbandry is doing more pollution, putting more pollution into our atmosphere and our waters than any other source.
So, in the Hindu world or in the Indian world, Indian darshanas, this idea is very much acceptable.
Yeah.
Because we see the whole. See, we can see the whole, the total. Whereas in the Christian world, this would be all the time contested. Because there, human beings are made in God's own image. They have a special status. In the Indian systems, human beings do not have a special status. They are special in the sense that they are more developed than others in terms of mind and other faculties, but they are not in God's own image. The whole creation is not is in God's image or is part of God.
Right.
There is no distinction between the supreme being and the inert creation. The creator and the created are one.
Right.
These very notions of Western secularism. And I think India should not use the word secularism at all, because secularism means something which is concerned with the world, with material life, which does not admit of the power and the maker capacity of a being which is different, higher than nature or physical nature. See, secularism means things which are entirely revolving around the material world. According to secularism, intelligence is a manifestation of certain chemical compositions. There is nothing like soul. So, Indian secularism, or I don't want to use the word secularism, the Indian idea of conduct would be dharma. Because the word dharma means that which sustains. And every part of creation has its own dharma. Because it is sustained by certain principles.
Yeah.
Even inert things are sustained.
Certain laws, yeah.
You know, water flows according to certain principles. So there is a dharma of water. There is a dharma of fire.
Yeah.
There is a dharma of air. Similarly, there is a dharma of various other forms of life. And you cannot say that one dharma is better than the other.
It's just that their dharma.
It is for them.
Yeah.
It is, dharma is individual.
And like, you always often hear that Hinduism is not a religion as we know of religions, it's a way of life. And it is because it's bigger than religion. So if you separate the state from the way of life, you've really just cut it off completely from reality.
I think way of life is an incomplete description.
Well, me too. I argue with Hindus all the time.
Yes. I think Radhakrishnan, who used it, did not mean it that way. I'm sure he could not have meant it that way. By way of life, I'm sure he didn't say this, but if questioned at that time, he would have said that it's not just a way of doing things, it's a way of thinking
yes.
as well.
No, that's,
it's a set of values as well.
I think that's what people think of when they say that.
So when people say way of life,
they don't mean that you practice Diwali. They mean that you appreciate the whole samskaras, samsaras, you know, all the things that make up
unless you do that, there
Hinduism.
is no Hindu darshana.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There is no Hindu darshana. And therefore, Indian secularism, first of all, if Indian secularism embraces complete diversity not only of a society, but of all forms of life and of all parts of creation, then it cannot talk of minority and majority. Because everything, collective or individual, is as valuable and has to live according to its own dharma. So how can you say that this will be the dharma for minorities, this will be the dharma for majorities? What has actually happened is that in practical talk and in practical politics, secularism only refers to again and again relations between so-called Hindus and so-called Muslims. Indian secularism is just another way of talking about Hindu-Muslim relations.
But they have it backwards.
But they do, yes, you're right.
They have it backwards because Hinduism is extremely secular religion. You can be an atheist and you can be a Hindu. You can be an agnostic. You can be anything you want to be in any one family. They're still together. They all practice the, Diwali and different festivals. But one may be an atheist. One may be into Ram. One into Shiva. One doesn't care. Another is very religious. They're very different within one family within the Hinduism. But in many other religions like Islam and Christianity, you have to pretty much toe the same line. You're very little deviation from what's from the main norm.
Yes, but the important thing is not that Islam and Christianity have less of theological and philosophical diversity. See, even if you grant the fact that yes, so-called Hinduism has a huge diversity of perception, whereas Christianity and Islam may not. What remains in terms of social polity is how are you going to establish a state or continue with the state, because the state has been established, has been there, in which the relationship between Hindus and Muslims has to be cordial. You see, because in India, 20% of the so-called minority is Muslim. Christians and Sikhs and Jains and Buddhas and whatever you may invent tomorrow, they would always be very small. The bulk would be Hindu Muslim. So when we talk of secularism, we are talking between the lines, we are talking of Hindu-Muslim relationship. So if we are able to now seriously think as to how we are going to create a cordiality between Hindu and Muslim relationship, then we would be following and working towards a state that looks upon all other people alike, that does not favor one or the other. For this, we have to be future oriented. I mean, we have to think out of box from within the Hindu community, and we have to think from out of box within the Muslim community. Now what has happened, and very unfortunately so, and I think the sin has to be laid largely at the doors of Jawaharlal Nehru, that he made it an article of faith and a practice that Islam in India would continue to be retrograde, regressive and backward thinking, and that would be defined as good Islam. And reform in Islam would be left to the free will of some mullahs. That's exactly the problem.
It's what's happened. And the universal.
And now when that happens, then you have a reaction from the majority community, and they want to be treated alike in the way the freedom to be regressive is given to the Muslims. This is the crux of the problem. So if the country as a whole looks to future, as to what do our children want, what do the young of India want? You see, we have to take opinion polls from them, cutting across the population, cutting across gender, from girls and women and old women and men and young men and old men, from all over, and as to what, and especially the young, because they are the future. If you ask them, what kind of laws do you want? It's not the mullahs who are going to tell what Muslim women should wear. It's educated Muslim women who are going to tell what they want to wear. Who has asked them? It is the young modern Hindu woman who has to answer, whom do I want to marry? Do I want to marry somebody from the Gotra, same Gotra or not? From the same community or not? You see, that is the reform which is needed. So if you want to go into future and revise the kind of morality that you have practiced, and in that revision you give no concession to any community by saying that you are minorities, we will wait for you to reform. Like so many Congress leaders, particularly Mani Shankar Iyer, I've heard so many times, we will not make any change in Sharia, personal Sharia, unless the Muslim community asks for it. This is the worst way of making a state in which people are treated with equality.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. It has been very nice.
Well,
And yes.
Yes, I just I think that the issues that we brought up here are very important for India as it progresses in its future. But I really do hope that more people become aware of these things, because I talk to people about Article 30 in the Constitution all the time, and most Indians aren't even aware of how it's applied, because it's misapplied, in my opinion. It wasn't intended to discriminate against the majority. But they have this whole concept in India about anti-majoritarianism. There's no democratic countries that have a concept like that. Even communal. In most countries, the word communal means something different. Here, it's a negative connotation. And so it's interesting how India has kind of twisted some of the political philosophy and in its application.
Well, you are right. As I said, that this was because Jawaharlal Nehru brought in the British model, that minorities are to be treated differently.
Have different laws and everything.
And different laws. So he started with something very wrong. And it is time that we talk about it, we discuss about it. Today, because we are questioning it, so there is a whole section of Indian establishment which is accusing intellectuals and writers of being intolerant, and which is very conveniently laying it at the doors of a political party, the RSS and the BJP. But that is not the truth. The truth is, time has come for Nehruvianism to go, and the Congress and the Nehruites should have an open mind to accept it. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.